They say the most expensive sound in corporate America is not a stock market crash. It is the sharp click of a boardroom door locking the wrong person in the hallway. When Julian Sterling kicked me out of our $2 billion funding pitch, I did not scream or beg. I simply smiled, took my coffee, and waited outside, holding the single sheet of exclusive patent paper that was about to burn his entire empire to the ground. Hello to all our wonderful listeners of the Boss Revenge Stories channel. I want to start by sincerely thanking you for your incredible support over the years. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the operating budget to continue uploading new videos here in the near future, which forces us to transition our operations entirely to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel to hear even better, longer, and fully dramatized exclusive true stories with deeply detailed situations and multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or pinned comment. Now, let us dive into today's tale of corporate hubris, where my name is Brooklyn Ross, and this is how I dismantled a billionaire's ego without raising my voice. I am 34 years old, and my hands do not look like they belong in a corporate boardroom. They are scarred from chemical burns, calloused from long nights tightening industrial clamps, and permanently stained from the rare earth metals I work with. I am a lead materials chemical engineer. More importantly, I am the sole architect and creator of the Quantum X solid-state battery core. That singular piece of technology was the only reason Ethercore Industries had transformed from a failing startup on the absolute brink of bankruptcy into the most coveted tech unicorn on the entire western seaboard. It was exactly 8:45 on a Monday morning. The atmosphere inside Ethercore headquarters, a massive glass and steel monolith situated in the hyper-modern Oakhaven Innovation District of Crestmont City, was practically vibrating with the scent of raw money. This was the day of reckoning. The heavy hitters, a syndicate of apex predator investors from Vanguard Summit Capital, were gathering on the executive floor. They were here to finalize a $2 billion funding round. I was not supposed to be up there. I preferred the quiet hum of the sub-basement laboratories to the sterile, high-altitude arrogance of the executive suite. But my desk phone had rung just 10 minutes prior. It was the chief legal officer, sounding breathless and panicked, demanding I come up immediately. I was carrying a heavy black folder under my arm. Inside that folder was the commercialization rights transfer agreement. It was the final, critical piece of paperwork needed before the historic deal could be closed. They needed my physical signature to legally transfer the manufacturing rights of my invention to the company. I stepped out of the elevator onto the 70th floor. The carpet was thick enough to swallow the sound of my sensible steel-toed work boots. I was wearing my standard uniform of dark denim jeans, a plain gray sweater, and a utilitarian field jacket with pockets full of styluses and flash drives. I looked exactly like what I was, a scientist who prioritized function over form. I stood out like a sore thumb in the sea of tailored Italian wool and silk ties. As I approached the grandiose floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the main boardroom, I could see the spectacle unfolding inside. Standing at the head of a massive mahogany table, bathed in the glow of an 80-inch presentation screen, was our CEO, Julian Sterling. Julian was a Wall Street rookie, a polished talking head, brought in by the panicked board of directors exactly 7 months ago for one specific purpose: to prettify the financial data and sell the company's potential to people exactly like the ones sitting in that room. He had never touched a beaker, never written a line of code, and certainly never spent 36 straight hours awake trying to stabilize a volatile lithium grid. But he sure knew how to wear a $5,000 suit and gesture emphatically at a rising bar chart. Julian was deep into his arrogant, self-congratulatory pitch. He paraded around the room with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had personally invented fire. Through the thick acoustic glass, I could barely hear the muffled bass of his voice, but his body language screamed absolute superiority. The investors from Vanguard Summit Capital watched him like hawks, their eyes gleaming with the promise of astronomical returns. I reached the threshold of the open boardroom door. I paused, waiting for a break in his presentation to step inside and hand the black folder to the legal team hovering nervously in the corner. Julian turned on his heel to emphasize a point and his eyes locked onto me. His gaze swept over me in a fraction of a second. He took in my messy hair, my distinct lack of designer labels, and the practical black folder clutched to my chest. In his shallow, finance-obsessed mind, the equation was instantly solved. I did not look like money. Therefore, I did not matter. He immediately assumed I was an administrative assistant bringing in extra copies, or perhaps a janitor who had wandered onto the wrong floor. Julian stopped his pacing. He flashed a condescending, perfectly white smile that did not reach his eyes. He raised a manicured hand, pointed a single finger directly at the hallway, and addressed me loudly enough for every billionaire in the room to hear. "Staff, please wait outside. This meeting is for executives only." A few low, dismissive chuckles rippled across the table from the vanguard investors. They did not even bother to look at my face. I was just a minor interruption, an annoyance in their multi-billion-dollar morning. I felt the frantic eyes of the chief legal officer widen in sheer terror from the back of the room, but he was too paralyzed by the sudden shift in power dynamics to speak up. I looked at Julian. I looked at his smug, ignorant face. I could have spoken. I could have announced exactly who I was and what I held in my hands, but I did not. I offered no explanation. I simply gave a polite, tight-lipped smile, clutched the black folder a little tighter, and took a deliberate step backward into the corridor. A junior partner sitting near the entrance reached out and pulled the heavy glass door shut. It closed with a definitive, airtight click, with that single, arrogant dismissal. Julian Sterling had just locked the only person holding the very lifeblood and legal salvation of his entire company out of the room. I stood perfectly still in the polished, soundproofed glass corridor. This transparent wall was the physical manifestation of corporate America's favorite boundary. On one side of the pristine pane sat the so-called decision-makers, men who traded in futures, leveraged buyouts, and unearned confidence. On my side stood the hired help, the invisible machinery that actually made their world function. I leaned my shoulder lightly against the cool glass, clutching the black folder, and watched a room full of apex predators enthusiastically carve up a future they did not actually own. The hallway was not entirely empty. A vice president of marketing, a man whose name I only knew because it was plastered on his reserved parking spot, breezed past me. He did not break his stride or even make eye contact as he shoved a thick stack of printed emails directly into my chest. "Shred these before lunch, please," he commanded, already checking his phone. A moment later, a director of human resources trotted by in 3-inch heels. She paused just long enough to look at my dark denim jeans and sigh. "When you go back down, tell catering we need 2 more pots of dark roast in the executive suite, and make sure the cups are actually clean this time." I did not argue with either of them. I let the marketing document slide from my hands into a nearby recycling bin. It was a fascinating clinical study in toxic workplace dynamics. In the cutthroat ecosystem of American finance, your entire worth was calculated in the first 3 seconds someone looked at you. Because I did not wear a tailored blazer or a designer watch, my doctorate in material science and my 10 years of grueling laboratory research were instantly overwritten by their assumption that my highest cognitive function was operating a coffee machine. It was insulting, yes, but in that specific moment, my invisibility was my greatest tactical advantage. Through the thick, smudge-free glass, the silent movie of Julian Sterling's catastrophic ego continued to play out. He had advanced his slideshow to a title card that read, in massive, bold font, "Infinite Energy Core Technology." He was pacing the length of the room, waving a laser pointer like a maestro conducting a symphony. Every single data point flashing on that 80-inch screen was ripped directly from my personal engineering notebooks. Every upward trending thermal efficiency chart was the direct result of my team inhaling chemical fumes, skipping meals, and sleeping under laboratory benches for weeks on end. Julian could not even pronounce the name of the polymer binding agent that made the battery stable. Yet there he was, selling my blood and sweat as his own brilliant strategic vision. I watched his mouth move, even without the audio. I knew exactly which script he was reciting. He was promising the Vanguard Summit Capital Syndicate that EtherCore would hit mass production by the third quarter of next year. He was outlining global supply chain logistics, projecting explosive, exponential profit curves, and guaranteeing them a total monopoly on the electric vehicle battery market for the next 2 decades. The investors were nodding aggressively. They were already spending their future dividends, completely mesmerized by the mirage he was painting. What those billionaires did not know, and what Julian in his profound arrogance had failed to thoroughly verify, was the true origin of the Quantum X technology. I did not invent the solid-state core while on the EtherCore payroll. 3 years ago, armed with a federal government grant for clean energy initiatives, I developed the foundational chemistry entirely on my own time, in a rented facility, under the legal umbrella of my own private limited liability company. EtherCore only came into the picture later, offering me a state-of-the-art laboratory space to refine the early prototype. When I signed my initial employment contract, I made sure my personal lawyers locked down every single loophole. I retained 100% of the intellectual property. I granted EtherCore a highly specific, painfully restrictive research and development license. That was it. That license allowed them to test the battery, build small-scale prototypes, and show off the results to raise capital. It absolutely did not give them the legal right to manufacture, sell, or commercialize a single unit, to move from the laboratory to the factory floor. EtherCore needed a completely separate, heavily negotiated commercialization license. That exact commercialization license was currently sitting inside the black folder I was holding against my chest, without my physical signature on those specific pieces of paper. Julian Sterling's grand $2 billion presentation was nothing more than a highly produced work of fiction. If he accepted a single dime of investor money promising them mass production rights he did not possess, he would instantly cross the line from corporate incompetence into federal securities fraud. I watched him confidently shake hands with the lead investor, completely oblivious to the fact that his empire was built on a legal landmine, and my boot was hovering directly over the trigger. Inside the boardroom, the dynamic shifted with the jarring suddenness of a car crash. The lead investor for Vanguard Summit Capital, a ruthless, silver-haired billionaire with a reputation for dissecting companies down to the bone, held up a single, commanding hand. The entire presentation ground to an immediate halt, even through the heavy, soundproofed glass. I could feel the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. This was the legendary due diligence phase. This was the precise moment where superficial sales pitches were brutally stripped away, leaving only cold, hard facts. The billionaire leaned forward, interlocked his fingers on the polished mahogany table, and began firing off the exact, razor-sharp questions I had been anticipating all morning. He demanded absolute, ironclad guarantees regarding the legal barriers to entry. He wanted a meticulous review of the intellectual property rights, the international patent protections, and the exact ownership structure of the Quantum X technology before he would even consider authorizing a wire transfer for $2 billion. Julian Sterling, completely intoxicated by the high of his own adrenaline and unearned authority, did not even flinch. A competent chief executive officer would have immediately deferred a question of this legal magnitude to his corporate counsel, but Julian suffered from a terminal, fatal case of executive arrogance. He had a notoriously dangerous habit of lightly skimming executive summaries and aggressively ignoring any complex technical or legal documents that crossed his desk. To him, intricate legal details were trivial matters meant for the lower class of the corporate hierarchy. He puffed out his chest, flashed his signature charismatic grin, and made the most catastrophic miscalculation of his entire professional life. He loudly and clearly guaranteed, staking his personal honor and the entire financial reputation of EtherCore Industries, that the company held 100% of the core patent permanently and irrevocably. My eyes instantly darted toward the shadowy corner of the room. The chief legal officer looked as though he had just been physically struck in the chest by a speeding freight train. A thick, heavy bead of cold sweat visibly rolled down his pale temple. glistening violently under the harsh fluorescent lights of the ceiling. He began aggressively and aimlessly shuffling the blank papers in front of him, his hands trembling slightly as he desperately tried to look anywhere except at the piercing gaze of the Vanguard Syndicate. He knew the terrifying, undeniable truth. He knew that the only legal document capable of making Julian's bold, billion-dollar claim a reality was resting quietly inside the black folder in my hands, completely devoid of my signature. I watched the lawyer open his mouth slightly, perhaps attempting to interject, to issue a soft legal correction, or to beg for a brief 10-minute recess. But Julian ruthlessly cut him off with another booming wave of hollow corporate buzzwords, effectively sealing his own fate and trapping his legal team in the blast radius. Standing motionless in the quiet corridor, a profound and chilling realization washed over my entire body. The situation unfolding behind that glass wall had just dramatically escalated far beyond a simple breach of a standard business agreement. This was no longer just an internal corporate dispute over licensing parameters or contract negotiations. By explicitly lying to an institutional investment syndicate to secure immense funding, Julian was actively, publicly, and brazenly committing federal securities fraud. He was aggressively soliciting capital based on proprietary assets he definitively did not possess. Every single confident word falling from his lips was actively adding another month to a potential federal prison sentence. The luxurious executive boardroom had instantly transformed from a place of high-level business into an active crime scene, and I was the sole, silent witness standing in the hallway holding the smoking gun. Right at that exact second, as the sheer gravity of his colossal, criminal blunder settled heavily into my mind, a violent vibration erupted against my hip. My personal cell phone was buzzing frantically inside the pocket of my utility jacket. It was not a standard text message alert. It was the specific, heavy, encrypted notification pattern I had carefully set up exactly 3 weeks ago for one highly confidential contact. I slowly reached into my pocket, keeping my eyes fiercely locked on the unfolding disaster inside the glass room, and pulled out the heavy device. The digital screen illuminated the dim space around me, displaying an urgent, secure message from the senior executive team at Meridian Global. Meridian Global was the absolute, undisputed titan of the East Coast energy sector. They were a ruthless, monolithic competitor that either core had been desperately trying to outrun and outmaneuver for the past 2 years. They possessed the massive global manufacturing infrastructure that we severely lacked, along with the endless capital to ruthlessly crush anyone in their path. For the past 4 months, we had been engaged in a highly classified shadow negotiation regarding the true ownership of my work. I unlocked the screen with my thumb and read the razor-sharp text illuminating the dark glass. The message was as cold and precise as a surgical scalpel. We agree to all your terms. The multi-million-dollar buyout contract for the exclusive commercialization rights and your official offer letter for the position of Chief Technology Officer have just been sent to your secure email. I stood in the stark illumination of the corridor, the heavy glass separating me from the impending disaster. My eyes flicked from the encrypted message to the secure email attachment it referenced. I opened the document right there in the hallway. I skimmed the heavily vetted 50-page contract Meridian Global had just delivered. Every single clause I had demanded over the past 4 months was meticulously laid out in pristine legal text. There was a staggering 8-figure upfront buyout clause, complete autonomy over the research and development budget, and the official title of Chief Technology Officer. The suffocating weight of the past 3 years instantly vanished from my shoulders. A fierce, electric wave of absolute freedom surged through my veins. I no longer needed to tolerate the patronizing charity of EtherCore Industries. I certainly did not need the insultingly cheap, one-sided commercialization contract they were trying to force down my throat. Through the transparent wall, the theatrical climax of Julian Sterling's grand deception was taking shape. The lead investor, wearing an expression of supreme satisfaction, reached inside his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. He unscrewed the cap with slow, deliberate precision. He was preparing to ink his name onto the binding term sheet, the foundational document that would formally authorize the transfer of $2 billion into either corps' corporate accounts. The internal public relations team, hovering at the edges of the room like vultures, raised their high-end cameras. The blinding burst of camera flashes began to subtly test the lighting, ready to capture the historic handshake that would cement Julian as a titan of industry. It was at that exact, perilous moment that the chief legal officer finally broke out of his paralyzed state. He must have subtly checked the internal digital system, only to discover the terrifying reality that the authorization file was still completely empty. His head snapped toward the heavy glass door. Through the glare, his eyes finally locked onto me, standing motionless in the corridor. Sheer, unadulterated panic warped his facial features. My phone instantly erupted into a chaotic symphony of desperate vibrations. The notifications cascaded down my screen in a rapid, overlapping waterfall. There were dozens of frantic text messages from the legal department and the terrified legal director himself. They were begging, demanding, and threatening me to immediately scan the signed authorization page and upload it to the secure internal server. They realized their golden boy chief executive officer had just promised the sun, the moon, and the stars to the most aggressive financial predators on the eastern seaboard, and he possessed absolutely zero legal backing to deliver on that promise. I did not type a reply. I did not even flinch. I simply pressed my thumb firmly against the side button of my phone and held it there until the screen faded to a lifeless black. I severed their only remaining lifeline to salvation. Moving with deliberate, unhurried grace, I unclasped my leather messenger bag. I took the heavy black folder containing EtherCore's worthless commercialization agreement and let it slide quietly into the dark depths of my bag. I was in no rush. I stood perfectly still for a few seconds longer, a silent spectator watching this ridiculous, tragically comedic play of arrogant fools rapidly approaching its catastrophic finale. The logical, self-preserving action would have been to turn around, walk down the 70 flights of stairs, and quietly vanish into the morning traffic of Crestmont City. I had my millions. I had my new title. I had won. But as I watched the billionaire lower his gold pen toward the pristine white paper, a different instinct took over. If I walked away in silence, those investors would lose $2 billion to a spectacular fraud, and Julian would spend the next 3 years tying up the courts with their stolen money. More importantly, I realized I wanted to be the one to hold the mirror up to his face. I wanted to personally shatter the fake, glittering halo of Julian Sterling and watch him realize that the invisible worker he banished to the hallway was the one holding the axe. I adjusted my grip on my bag, turned my body toward the heavy boardroom door, and prepared to step out of the shadows. The heavy latch of the boardroom door gave way with a resounding, metallic clack that echoed like a gunshot through the sudden silence of the executive suite. I pushed the massive glass pane open with both hands, just as the sharp pop of a champagne cork echoed from the far corner of the room. Julian was already prematurely celebrating his victory before the ink was even dry. The rich aroma of expensive sparkling wine mingled heavily with the stale scent of corporate greed. My steel-toed work boots struck the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, rhythmic thud. I knew they expected the soft click of designer heels or the silent glide of a terrified subordinate, but my boots made an undeniable declaration that the natural order of their kingdom had just been violently disrupted. Every single head around that massive mahogany table snapped in my direction. The board of directors froze entirely. Glasses of champagne were suspended in mid-air. The public relations team lowered their cameras, unsure if this was part of the scripted presentation or a catastrophic security breach. Julian's artificially tanned face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. The veins in his neck strained against the collar of his custom silk shirt. He slammed his palm flat against the table, completely shattering his carefully curated image of a poised executive. "I explicitly told you to wait outside," he bellowed. His voice cracked slightly under the crushing weight of his own fury. He shot a frantic, wild glare toward the transparent walls looking for help. "Where is building security? Get this woman out of my boardroom immediately." I did not even grant him the dignity of a flinch. I completely ignored the loud barking of a desperate, cornered man, keeping my eyes fiercely locked on the only person in the room who actually held real power. I walked with absolute purpose past the rows of stunned executives. I marched straight to the head of the long table, where the lead billionaire investor sat. His solid gold fountain pen was still hovering mere inches above the signature line of the binding term sheet. I stopped right across from him. The air between us crackled with raw tension. I offered a calm, polite smile that completely defied the suffocating hostility radiating from Julian on the other side of the room, moving with deliberate grace. I reached into my leather bag and withdrew a single sheet of heavy, watermarked parchment. It was not the cheap, exploitative corporate contract EtherCore had prepared. It was the original, government-issued intellectual property certificate, complete with the raised federal seal and holographic security stamp. I placed it gently onto the polished wood, sliding it right over the blank signature line to block his pen. I looked directly into the sharp, predatory eyes of the lead investor and spoke with a voice as clear and cold as winter ice. Every single syllable was a hammer striking a nail into Julian's coffin. If you gentlemen are planning to disburse $2 billion to manufacture this solid-state core technology, you should probably know one crucial fact. The sole and exclusive commercialization rights for this invention were just sold outright by me to Meridian Global exactly 3 minutes ago. The silence that immediately followed my declaration was absolute and terrifying. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen straight out of the room. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning struggling to breathe. Then, Julian burst into a loud, theatrical fit of laughter. It was a harsh, synthetic sound, vibrating with sheer, unadulterated panic. He practically sprinted from his presentation screen, trying to physically position his body between me and the investors, waving his hands dismissively as if he could swat away reality. "Gentlemen, please accept my deepest apologies for this bizarre and highly inappropriate interruption," Julian sneered. He was struggling violently to maintain his charming facade, while heavy beads of sweat pooled at his temples and rolled down his jawline. "This is simply a cheap disruption from a disgruntled, low-level laboratory assistant suffering from severe delusions of grandeur. She has absolutely zero legal authority here. Security will remove her in a second, and we can proceed with the signing as planned." He reached out his hand to casually sweep my certificate off the table, treating the most valuable piece of paper in the building like a stray candy wrapper. But the veteran billionaire moved much faster. He slammed his heavy hand down onto the paper, trapping it against the wood and stopping Julian dead in his tracks. The billionaire investor did not laugh. Men who manage billions of dollars do not survive their industries by laughing off sudden anomalies. His eyes narrowed to dangerous slits as his fingers traced the raised texture of the federal seal. He recognized the undeniable authenticity of a government patent document the second he touched it. His gaze shifted slowly from the bold printed name on the certificate to my face, and then slowly over to the shadowy corner of the room where the chief legal officer was practically hyperventilating against the wall. Without saying a single word, the billionaire stood up from his leather chair. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps over to the trembling lawyer and forcefully snatched the thick legal dossier straight out of his sweating hands. The entire room watched in a state of sheer paralysis as the investor rapidly flipped through the pages of the due diligence report. It only took him 15 seconds to locate the licensing and intellectual property section. We all watched the exact, devastating moment. His highly trained brain processed the catastrophic truth. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. The aura of supreme confidence that had surrounded him all morning completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror as he realized how close he had just come to throwing $2 billion into a burning furnace. The billionaire investor did not just speak. He unleashed a force of nature. His massive, heavy fist slammed down onto the polished mahogany table with the violence of a thunderclap. The crystal champagne flutes violently vibrated, two of them toppling over, spilling expensive vintage wine across the immaculate surface like a bleeding wound. He turned his terrifying, unblinking gaze directly toward Julian Sterling. The veins in the older man's neck bulged against his collar as he demanded a comprehensive explanation for this astronomical, unprecedented level of blatant corporate deception. His voice was a low, dangerous growl that shook the very foundation of the room. He did not ask Julian. He commanded the chief legal officer to speak the absolute truth. The lawyer, completely broken and realizing that protecting his CEO would now guarantee him a cell in a federal penitentiary, finally cracked under the immense pressure. He pressed his back flat against the wall, his knees visibly shaking, and stared at the floor. In a small, defeated voice, he confessed to the entire room. He admitted, completely and unequivocally, that Ethercore Industries had never possessed the commercial manufacturing rights to the solid-state core. He confirmed that every single promise Julian had just made regarding mass production and global distribution was legally impossible, entirely fabricated, and built on a foundation of absolute vapor. The moment that confession hit the air, the pristine executive boardroom descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The illusion of civility shattered into a million jagged pieces. The other members of the Vanguard Syndicate erupted from their luxurious leather chairs, their faces twisted in pure, unadulterated outrage. The lead billionaire did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He grabbed the highly anticipated, legally binding term sheet, the document meant to authorize the transfer of $2 billion, and violently tore it precisely in half. He tore it again and again, raining the shredded pieces of Julian's shattered empire down onto the spilled champagne. Men who controlled the global economy began shouting over one another, frantically pulling out their phones to call their private legal teams. The threats of calling the Securities and Exchange Commission, involving the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and ensuring Julian Sterling served decades in a federal prison for wire fraud, echoed off the soundproof glass walls. The public relations team, realizing they were currently documenting a massive felony, quietly and frantically packed their cameras and fled toward the emergency exit. Julian went into a complete, catastrophic freefall from the absolute pinnacle of corporate power down into a terrifying, bottomless abyss. The artificial color completely drained from his face, leaving behind a sickening, translucent shade of white. His perfectly tailored $5,000 suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big on his shrinking frame. His legs gave out beneath him, causing him to stumble heavily against the edge of the conference table. As the reality of his impending criminal charges and absolute financial ruin washed over him, a primal, pathetic panic took over his body. He lunged across the room, scrambling with zero dignity toward the heavy glass door. He threw his body weight against the handle, desperately trying to block my only exit. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive officer was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, whimpering man. He lowered his voice to a desperate, breathless whisper, his eyes wide with sheer terror. He begged me to stay. He pleaded for just 5 minutes of negotiation. He frantically promised to completely rewrite my contract right there on the spot. He offered me 20% equity in the entire company, a seat on the executive board, and the highest technical position in the corporate structure. He promised me wealth beyond my wildest imagination if I would just call Meridian Global and cancel the transfer. I looked at the pathetic, desperate creature blocking my path. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no anger, only the cold, satisfying clarity of absolute closure. I reached out and smoothly, but with undeniable, punishing force, brushed his trembling hands off the door handle. I stepped into his personal space, forcing him to shrink back against the thick glass. I locked my eyes directly onto his terrified gaze and delivered the final fatal blow to his shattered ego. "The first business lesson you should ever learn, Julian," I said, my voice ringing out clearly over the chaotic shouting of the panicked investors behind me. "Never lock the boardroom door to trap yourself inside with your own ignorance, and then kick the only person holding your actual lifeline out into the hallway." I did not wait for his response. There was nothing left to say. I turned the handle, pulled open the heavy glass door, and walked out into the corridor, leaving behind a suffocating, dead silence that had suddenly fallen over the room as my words registered. I walked away from a man whose career was entirely over, and a company that was absolutely, mathematically guaranteed to file for bankruptcy before the stock market opened the following morning. I took the express elevator down 70 floors. The descent felt entirely different this time. The crushing weight of unappreciated labor and stolen credit was completely gone. I pushed through the massive revolving doors of the main lobby and stepped out into the blinding, beautiful sunlight of Crestmont City. The heavy, warm air felt like absolute freedom, parked flawlessly along the curb, waiting exactly where they said it would be, was a sleek, midnight black luxury sedan sent by Meridian Global. The driver, wearing an immaculate suit, respectfully opened the rear door for me. I slid into the plush leather seat, setting my leather bag resting gently beside me. I was no longer an invisible, overworked laboratory assistant waiting for scraps. I was heading directly toward a brilliant, highly lucrative future as a true, undeniably powerful chief technology officer. The revenge was completely finalized. It was completely silent, entirely bloodless, but absolutely, devastatingly absolute. To all our incredible listeners out there, thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in and walking through this journey with me today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story satisfying and want to hear more, I have a massive favor to ask. As I mentioned earlier, our channel has been entirely demonetized, which means we have absolutely zero budget to continue uploading new videos here in the near future. We are transitioning our entire operation over to Patreon to survive. Please help us keep these stories alive by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. Over there, you will get access to the absolute best, highly detailed, and entirely exclusive true stories that are far too intense for us to publish on this platform. You can easily join us right now by scanning the quick response code currently displayed on your screen, or by simply clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description and the pinned comment below. Thank you again, and I cannot wait to share the next incredible story with you over on Patreon.